Okay, we're again doing an overview of the book, which is called Psychology of Quality of Life. My name is Joseph Sergi. I'm the author of the book, and again, we're continuing with that overview. Um, we are now up to uh, that part of the book which deals with objective reality and its effects on happiness, and we're reviewing much of the evidence related to how certain objective aspects in the environment affects personal happiness. And on that note, to give you sort of an idea of how of this overall part of the book, it deals with economic effects, political effects, sociocultural effects, effects of demographics, effects of personal activities, effects of the environment, effects of the genetics, effects of health, effects from drugs, effects of biological factors on personal happiness. And we're up to now the effects of personal activities. So, this is what we're going to be talking about in this module. Um, so, in talking about this, in discussing the much of the research on personal activities and on happiness, we want to talk about some of the popular theories that have addressed the link between activities and happiness. And these involve classical conditioning, activity theory, flow theory, and personal expressiveness theories. And then we'll talk about, what are the effects of specific activities like social activities, leisure activities, recreational activities, spiritual and community activities, and shopping activities on personal happiness, and talk about the research in that area. Okay, let's focus on the quality of life theories related to activities. Classical conditioning is pretty obvious, and that is we tend to engage in certain kinds of activities that are rewarding. So, if an activity is rewarding to us, then ultimately we would engage in the same activity over and over again, and for the reward value. And plus, certain activities are are automatically classically conditioned um, with a positive reward, and therefore we 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 engage in those activities because of the classical conditioning. And actually, it's more than classical conditioning. Also, it's uh, respondent type of conditioning too. So that's pretty obvious. Another theory that has been around for quite a while, and it comes from gerontology, is activity theory. And the theory is simply stated is that uh, elderly people uh, who tend to experience higher level of subjective well-being tend to remain active. If they don't remain active, their happiness plummets, so to speak. So, in order to maintain a certain level of happiness, one has to remain active. And there's an abundance of data and research about that um, um, that show very clearly that elderly who remain active tend to experience higher level of subjective well-being than those who are less active. Another theory that again gained quite a bit of popularity in quality of life studies and well-being research is flow theory. Flow theory, for those people who may be familiar with um, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, if I'm pronouncing it right. Um, he's done so much research on the idea of flow and how flow contributes to subjective well-being. And the idea of flow is pretty simple, and that is when people become so engrossed and absorbed in an activity, they kind of lose their sense of time, um, and they become so intrinsically motivated in performing that activity. Um, that kind of engagement in the activity generates a sense of what he calls flow, and that experience itself contributes to personal happiness or personal well-being. Let me. He provides a very nice quotation in one of his books, which is called "Finding Flow." And let me read you that quotation. The quality of life does not depend on happiness alone, but also on what one does to be happy. If one fails to develop goals that give meaning to one's existence, if one does not use the mind to its fullest, then good feelings fulfill just a fraction of the potential we possess. A person who achieves contentment by withdrawing from the world to cultivate his own garden, like Voltaire's Candide, um, cannot be said to lead an excellent life. Without dreams, without risks, only a trivial semblance of living can be achieved. Very nice quotation that really captures the idea that, again, quality of life, subjective well being comes from engaging in activities, taking risks, and doing and being alive by doing things. Um, the last theory that I want to kind of hint to, or maybe describe very briefly, is has become known in the quality of life literature as personal expressiveness. And this is attributed to a psychologist by the name of Waterman and his colleague. Um, yeah, what he did is he argued for what you call a eudaimonistic identity theory. And the idea is that identity development proceeds most successfully when people identify their best potential and engage in activities that move them towards realizing those potentials. Engagement in those healthy eudaimonistic activities produce feelings of personal expressiveness. For example, a person may train for a marathon not only because he or she views running as serving instrumental goals such as health or glory, but primarily for intrinsic experiential rewards. It makes the person feel alive and feel intensely involved. In other words, engaging in the activity leads the person towards a state of eudaimonia, according to Aristotle, the goal of well being, not only as a psychological state, but, but also as a rational one. The key point, though, is that the reward is intrinsic because the feeling in is an end in itself. So that's these are essentially four major theories that explains how engagement in certain personal in certain kinds of activities. I'm talking about social activities, leisure activities, spiritual activities, and so forth, tend to contribute to personal happiness. Okay, let's now talk about the research related to specific activities. And if we're looking at specific activities, I'm looking at a table that deals with how certain activities lead to happiness, hours spent by day, and the effect of happiness of a whole bunch of different activities from intimate relation, socializing after work, dinner, relaxing, lunch, exercising, praying, socializing at work, watching TV, phone at home, napping, cooking, shopping, housework, childcare, evening commute, working, morning commute, and and what are those activities that lead to the greatest happiness? And I'm looking at the numbers, the means. on a 5-point scale, and these are ordered in terms of intimate relations. So engaging in intimate relations, of course, contributes to happiness the most. After that, you've got socializing after work, dinner, relaxing, lunch, exercising, praying, socializing at work, and so forth down the list. So this sort of gives you an idea of what activities tend to produce quite a bit of happiness. Let's talk about the research related to specific activities like social activities, leisure activities, and so forth. Now, um, when it comes to social activities, again, a very large number of studies have found positive correlations between objective measures of social activities and subjective well-being. Even the findings from longitudinal studies have suggested a very strong relationship. Engagement in social activities do indeed, does indeed contribute to subjective well-being. So again, there is indisputable evidence that suggests that social activities seems to really does a good job in making a contribution to personal happiness. Another topic which is leisure and recreation activities. And here again, we're looking at things like arts related activities, such as listening to music, playing music, dancing, watching dance performance, attending play and theater, movie going, painting, engaging in sculpture and pottery, reading literature such as novels, short stories, and poetry, engaging in photography, quilting and gardening, flower arranging, and textile and fabric art activities. Again, some of the research have looked into this, and they looked at what kind of activities, and recreational activities in relation to arts, and the extent to which those activities tend to be correlated with high levels of subjective well-being. And frankly, and yeah, the the relationships or um, the correlations are not not impressive. And as a matter of fact, the vast majority of them are non-significant. And I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised because when you're looking at the extent to which you engage in those kinds of activities, and then you look at subjective well-being, and you really expect a direct relationship, well, that's a tall order. You're really expecting too much. Um, if the reason why you don't make that connection is because in doing this kind of research, you need to figure out what are those mediating variables between engagement in those kinds of activities and ultimately subjective well-being. And if you remember, we talked about bottom-up theory. Bottom-up theory says that there is a satisfaction hierarchy, and engaging in certain kinds of activities at the very bottom of that hierarchy contributes to domain satisfaction. So let's say engage in maybe something sculpture or pottery. Well, how does that activity contribute to what positive or negative affect in what domain, whether it's social life, work life, maybe a leisure life, family life, and the extent to which that contribution makes is significant, is salient in relation to those life domains, then ultimately that might spill over at a more abstract level and influence life satisfaction or hedonic well-being. So again, I'm not surprised that the correlations are weak, and it's very hard to do this. But bottom up spillover theory suggests that yeah, it can be demonstrated, and possibly future studies will be able to do that. Okay, how about spiritual and community activities? And the overwhelming evidence is that people engage in community and spiritual activities tend to experience higher level of subjective well-being. Remember this whole idea of spiritual activities. Spiritual activities is uh, part of it. The reason why it contributes to subjective well-being is because it involves fellowship. Fellowship, as we talked about in terms of social activities, it it produces what you call social capital. And for those people who have social capital, they tend to experience higher level of subjective well-being. So I'm not surprised at all, in, in the kind of findings that we see in the literature, connecting or linking spiritual activities with subjective well-being. When it comes to community, when it comes to community activities, we've got things like participation in community service. And again, there's evidence that participation in community service contribute to subjective well-being. How about membership in community organizations, non-church organizations? And again, yes, that contributes to subjective well-being, and we have much evidence to document this phenomenon. How about things like volunteering? Well, volunteering also does the same thing. Those people engage in volunteering activities within their community tend to experience higher level of subjective well-being. There's also much literature on caregiving, uh, but then this literature seems to be controversial in the sense that the findings are positive, negative, no no relationship between, and again, some of the quality of life researchers who are involved in this area, they talk about care caregiving burden. It's quite a burden that takes away from subjective well-being rather than adding it. But in my mind, I think that there is quite a distinction between engaging in caregiving activities that are voluntary. So let's say, for example, a retired person would volunteer to take care of others, and he made that decision autonomously rather than being forced to it. It's not really necessarily part of his job. Um, then if that person is doing it for intrinsic reason rather than extrinsic reason, it's very likely that this kind of caregiving activities would lead to or contribute to subjective well-being. Now, on the other hand, caregiving, if it is done extrinsically because the person has to, it may be a family member or maybe is doing it for money and only for that purpose, just to make money, then it's very likely that there will be a caregiving burden, which would contribute um, to life dissatisfaction rather than life satisfaction. Finally, we have things related to practicing compassion. For those people who practice compassion, and you can actually think in terms of caregiving is practicing compassion if one is intrinsically motivated. If one is practicing compassion, for intrinsic purposes, then again, there's much evidence that suggests that such activity leads to subjective well-being. Okay, well, let's turn to the last topic, which is shopping activities. And here you've got, there's quite a bit of evidence too that suggests that shopping, to a certain extent, for certain kinds of people, leads to subjective well-being. People really get involved in shopping, and there's social capital there. People because shop together, people acquire the kinds of goods and services that ultimately help them satisfy a whole bunch of different needs that, of course, satisfying those needs would contribute to subjective well-being. And so there is definitely a positive element of shopping activities. But on the other hand, there is, for those people who shop too much, and much of the literature talk about compulsive shopping. For those people who end up overspending, and shopping to the point where they would talk about shop till you drop. That's essentially being compulsive in shopping, and that literature suggests that this kind of shopping leads to lower levels of subjective well-being. Okay, I think we're done with this module, so we'll stop here.